and welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. Today, I want to talk to you about 10 ways to serve women and children in crisis. Now, since the Dobbs case came down, the case that overturned Roe versus Wade and returned the issue of abortion to the states, the issue of abortion has been front and center in American public life. I've heard a number of great sermons and clips on this issue as well, saying basically two things. The first, believe in the sanctity of life as a pre-political biblical belief that we're created in God's image, and therefore from conception until natural death, we're of equal dignity, of equal worth, worthy of the protection of our laws. And so this is true. But on the other hand, as the church, we are called to serve the most vulnerable among us. You think of James saying that the true religion is serving the widow and the fatherless, those that would have been kind of at the lower end of the society there in Scripture, the most vulnerable in that society. So we're called to do that as well, and to do both well. So today I want to be as practical as I can to just give you a couple of ways that your church, your community can serve women and children in crisis. As I do, just a quick reminder, perhaps if you haven't listened to the podcast for long, we are busy connecting pastors with government officials, and we want to minister to those officials, but then also partner with them for the common good. As we've had an opportunity to meet with our governor, with the head of the Department of Child Services in Indiana, and both of them have encouraged the church to step up, impact the issue of foster care, engage in serving women and children in crisis. And so this is something we've been studying for some time, not something we just started thinking about when the Dobbs case came down. And so I want to share just some of the practical ideas that we've gathered in that effort, in that project. Before I jump into the 10, I did want to give you kind of a brief update from the state of Indiana and ask for you to pray, as Indiana is the first state in the nation to take up the issue of abortion since the Dobbs case came down. The Indiana legislature convened this week in a special session. The Senate has led with a bill that would ban abortion, includes exceptions such as the life of the mother, rape, and incest. That if you've followed abortion policy for long, you're probably familiar with some of these things. More conservative groups, and including myself, I'm concerned by this, that the bill does not include much in the way of enforcement, in the sense that it leaves enforcement up to local prosecutors. And a major prosecutor here in the state of Indiana said he will not enforce such a bill. And so that's certainly concerning. There are other issues / loopholes, and so you would imagine that there would probably be fighting in between the Democrats and the Republicans on this one, but there's not just that, and that certainly is there, but also wrestling between the more kind of conservative Republicans and those that are more kind of establishment Republicans over the language of this bill. And so if you would just say perhaps a quick prayer for the state of Indiana, certainly our legislators, as they take up this issue. On Monday, there was a major pro-choice rally at the State House. I was there kind of standing outside the Senate chamber, and I have to give it to them for perhaps 6, 7, maybe 8 hours. These individuals kept up chants and screams kind of at the top of their lungs, things like "my body, my choice," 2, 4, 6, 8, separate the church and state, things like that. And if you've never experienced something like this, it is concerning, and it's something that I've reflected on a bit, just kind of the rage and the vehemence of some on that side of this debate, and something that's still kind of ringing in my ears. And then on Tuesday was a pro-life rally. We had a hand in helping organize the Love Them Both rally, to encourage legislators to take up the issue of life and to, in fact, protect the unborn. So if you would, I just pray for wisdom for our legislators, for Indiana Family Institute, other organizations that are working on this issue. Certainly would appreciate that. I'll talk perhaps just a little more about that as we walk through these 10 steps. With that said, let's jump right into the 10 ways to serve women and children in crisis. The first one is prayer. Now, I know some of you may be thinking, I thought we were going to be talking about what to do. Well, prayer is doing something for sure. And the more I've looked at this issue and kind of experienced what's going on at the State House, I can sometimes fall into the under-spiritualization of what's going on. And I've had several pastors just remind me of that lately. And I appreciate that encouragement, because we can over spiritualize things at times. However, it's also easy just to look at, all right, what's on the page, what are the provisions going into a bill, how many votes, and not to step back and see what we know is a wrestling not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of the world. That there is a spiritual element to this battle. But then also you think of Proverbs 21:1, that the king's heart is in the hands of the Lord as the rivers of water. He turns it whithersoever he will. We know from Scripture that those in authority right now are placed there by God. They're his ministers for our good. And so to take some time to actually step back and significantly pray, or to meaningfully pray about these issues, and not just maybe for a moment, but some extended time to maybe fast and to pray. What a remarkable opportunity for American Christian citizens. As I've spoken to so many about the issue of life, kind of the first thing I'll often hear is, I never thought this was going to happen in my lifetime. And yet here we are. What an opportunity for the church to stand up for the life of the unborn, but then to serve women and children in crisis. And just kind of one practical way to do that, I was so blessed to spoke at a church in Greenwood, Indiana, a few weeks ago. And the Saturday before, they had an extended prayer time from 11 a.m. up till 6 p.m. And I'll just give you kind of the breakdown of what they prayed over. From 11 to noon was adoption, 12 to 1, the life of the marginalized, 1 to 2, foster care, 2 to 3, expectant parents, 3 to 4, the loss in life, and then 4 to 6, mothers and fathers. And so I just thought that was a great example of a church, taking some extended, dedicated time to pray for the life issue. And so if you haven't had an opportunity to do that, again, I'm trying to be really practical here today, just having a dedicated prayer time, as maybe the issue is a little more settled in your state. Well, pray for the nation, pray for all that's going on. And as you see the news with all these court cases and all of these legislative actions taking place. So that would be number one, to pray. And we, of course, will have this full list in the show notes if you want to just take a look there. The second one is to participate, volunteer for a pregnancy care center. And I know many of you, again, are just thinking, well, I knew this already, but just hold on, I wanted to dig into the details a little bit more. And I'm of the persuasion that it is the pregnancy care center movement that has expanded across this country, impacts almost every zip code in our nation. That is what has truly changed the culture of life in our country. Now, we still have a lot of work to do, but I think it's being the hands and feet of Jesus, caring for women in an unplanned or crisis pregnancy, that has been the force, the motivation for many people to reconsider what is the church's position. All right, if they say we stand for life, but then they're willing to put boots on the ground, they're willing to help on a daily basis. And so I'm just so blessed. Many times we criticize the church, kind of the big C church, for failing in various ways. But I do think it's important to praise the church, the movement of believers here in the United States, when we do something well. And I think the Pregnancy Care Center movement is certainly one of those. As I've spoken to leaders of pregnancy care centers, certainly one of the developments right now is that many individuals are moving from actually going to a brick and mortar abortion clinic, and they're pivoting to chemical abortions. In fact, more than half of abortions in the United States are done through chemicals, through pills. And so many of the centers are pivoting to abortion pill reversal. And that means that they have to do a lot of intense advertising, some work on their websites, SEO work, so that their pages will pop up first if somebody is searching for something like abortion services. And so that's one way. That's certainly something that you can donate towards, or maybe even assist in, given your particular skill set. So a lot of these clinics are moving towards that. Also, many of these clinics are also doing some abstinence education, either directly or through kind of spin-off ministries, and going into public schools. And it makes a lot of sense if you're working on the sanctity of life to help explain abstinence. And for example, in the state of Indiana, our Our sex ed is based on abstinence. There's a lot of federal funding that's gone into that as well. And so there may be a ministry near you that you could be involved in, and could even go into public schools and help with that if you feel called to it. So again, just either volunteering, assisting your pregnancy care center. I know many of these centers do parenting classes, provisions of basic necessities, diapers for young women, and also expanding even into STI testing for men. And so there's so much that can be done at your local pregnancy care center. So again, just we're checking some boxes here. Practically, what can you do? That's certainly a big one. Number 3 would be to assist with a home that provides shelter and care for abused women or pregnant women that are no longer welcome in their home or are homeless. Also, teenagers that find themselves pregnant and their family wants them to get an abortion. They don't want to. Maybe they're even a part of the foster care system, or they've been neglected, they've been abused, and they don't feel safe at home. I just recently met a ministry like this in South Indy called the Angel House that's just getting up and running. And so if you can imagine being maybe a 16-year-old teenage woman, a teenage girl, pregnant, family, dad, mom is non-existent, or maybe they're just putting a roof over your head. They're not supportive of you keeping the baby. Then, well, what do you do? Where do you go? Well, this particular house is going to provide a solution for that. And of course, they need funding. They need a house. They often will need house mothers, other support staff. And so that's, again, just another way, thinking kind of just down the list here as we're trying to think, all right, so let's be praying. Can we help these moms as they're going through the pregnancy to encourage them to keep the baby? Next would be, well, if they want to keep the baby, but their current housing situation is hostile towards that, well, we need to practically provide them a place to stay, help them, support them during that pregnancy. So that'd be number 3. The fourth one would be through ministries like Family Hope. And this is to provide short-term support for mothers. Many listeners might be familiar with Safe Families, which would be a ministry very similar to Family Hope. And the way this works is if you have a single mom that maybe already has children, she's pregnant again, and doesn't trust anyone. Like, what does she do when she has to go in and deliver a child and she has no one that she trusts to watch her children? What does she do? This was a question that was asked by Meredell Sandberg from Together for Good when we interviewed her, if you remember that particular episode. And so how can the church step in? And this is all pre-involvement from the state. How can ministries be there when someone in our churches or even someone in our community experiences a crisis and they don't know where to turn? Well, can the church be there with properly screened, background checked individuals, almost similar to like a foster care screening from the state, but with professionals saying, hey, we background screen families, and that single mom in a time of crisis can say, hey, in a sense, this is kind of your Uncle Jim, your Aunt Sarah. These are people that we know, that we trust, and you're going to go stay with them for a short period of time while I get my feet back underneath me. And what's great about this particular option for service is that it keeps these kids out of foster care and keeps that family out of, quote unquote, the system altogether. And so there are various ministries that do this. Certainly Family Hope is one here in Indiana. Better Together is one in Florida. And we've talked to Meredell Sandberg from Together for Good up in kind of the Minnesota and Iowa area. And these ministries all separated from Safe Families due to concerns over not staying true to their statement of faith. And if you've been in that space, I'll leave that up to your conscience. But similar to the Bethany Christian Services, if you know what happened there, many of those coming out of Safe Families are saying similar things. And so I'll leave it up to you to investigate that and determine it according to your conscience. But essentially, this is a great way for the church to step in and provide services to women in crisis. The next one, number 5, would be the care portal or something similar. And what this does allows the Department of Child Services or a similar agency in your state, when they have a physical need, like a bed, like clothing, if those needs aren't met, then generally the state is required to pull those kids out of the parents' custody and place them in foster care. Well, Care Portal allows DCS, this would not be an issue of, say, sex abuse or drug abuse, but this would be an issue of just basic financial need, basic physical needs. And DCS can put this into the Care Portal system. This is going to go out to participating churches. And what's great about this is the church can actually show up with a bed, with food, and keep kids out of the foster care system. We've talked about Care Portal a good bit on the podcast before, so I won't go into much more detail. But this is expanding nationwide. Here in Indiana, we've had a couple pilot counties that have done real well, and it is now expanding. And again, just a very simple, great way to be able to serve families, then connect with them as a person and help them out. Number 6 would be something I would loosely call a care community. So as we're talking about foster care here now, and we've moved from prayer to helping a pregnancy care center, which is just supporting that young mom. Something like an angel house is going to help a young woman that wants to keep the baby, but is in perhaps an abusive situation. To then, well, how can we kind of provide temporary guardianships, temporary help for a family? And then Care Portal, how do we provide that food? How do we provide that bed so that that family stays together? Well, now we're moving into, well, if all of that doesn't work and kids are actually removed from the home, placed into foster care, the care community model says, we're going to ask people in our churches to join in providing foster care. But the stats are terrible. And it's so difficult. If you've talked to foster care parents, if you've done that yourself, you know how hard it is. And sometimes it'd be like, well, great, or we're so glad that you're doing that. We'll be praying for you. But the stats have held pretty steady. And that's something like 90% of foster care families quit after their first year or their first placement. Now, some of that's getting a little bit better, but it's still up there. And so how, as the church, could we provide support to these families that have gone to bat? I mean, they're bringing kids into their home. They are changing their lives to help the least of these. So the care community model is, all right, you have a family in your church, or maybe even just a family in the community. Say, hey, can we bring over dinner? Can we get background screened in partnership with DCS or relevant state agency and provide a date night out for foster mom and foster dad so that they can have just a breather, a break, and support them in any way possible? One of the great stories about this type of care community came from a pastor who's just giving a testimony about a Sunday school in his church. And this Sunday school would have been populated by more experienced Christians, or some might call them senior saints. And, they were meeting, but from time to time, it just seemed like there were complaints about various things in the church. And you know how that can be sometimes in church life. And we Christians, we love to grumble sometimes. And this particular small group Bible study caught the vision for being a care community for foster families in the church. And this Sunday school class just wrapped themselves around these foster families, began pouring into them, and just found real joy, real community in doing that. So again, maybe we're not all in a season of life that we can have a child into our home, but we can all do something. And so the care community model through organizations like Hands of Hope, and there are many organizations doing these sorts of things. That's another way to serve. So again, care communities would be number 6. Number 7 is, again, more traditional foster care, and that is to sign up. Josiah White's, we've had Ron Evans on the podcast. They are a Christian foster care agency. They help license foster care families, help train them, help them walk through that situation and provide support for them. Now, as we've talked to Director Stiggin, who's the head of our DCS, a development in that area is that a lot of families are happy to bring in, say, the 16-month-old or the 9-month-old. It's a different story if you have a 16-year-old, or if you have siblings, a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, a 16-year-old, whatever it is. That's very different. than bringing in a young child, maybe even an infant, into your home. But because of that difficulty, that's exactly where the state needs help. And so some of our ministries here in Indiana are pivoting to try to meet that need. But that's one development where I think our churches can really jump in and help. I was blessed today to meet with a church here in Indianapolis that actually started a foster care ministry just a few years ago. And now they have an actual pastor dedicated to foster care ministry. They've seen the number of families involved in foster care go north of 30 in their church. That'd be 30 families. So I was just so blessed to see that particular church making such a big difference in their zip code. And so that'd be number 7. How do we serve the least of these? How do we serve women and children in crisis? Well, become a foster care provider or a foster care family. And that often means that you're going to have interactions not just with the child, but also with biological mom, biological dad. You can be an encouragement to them as well. Number 8, and that would be adoption. Now, again, this is, more traditional, but yes, we have kids in foster care that need to be adopted. And similar to foster care itself, DCS here in Indiana has encouraged adoption of kids that are over the age of 9. That those kids often don't find a home. They aren't adopted because they're a bit older. And so if God moves your heart in that way, I know that's a need here in Indiana, but also around the country. So adoption. Part of that I would mention, and this is a fairly new development, is that a lot of states, or I would say at least some states, have adopted what I might call a safe haven law. And they're often called baby boxes. And in fact, we just recently had one installed in our town. And so if a young woman feels that there's no way she can provide for this child, there's just too much going on, then the state has provided a way where she can drop off this baby in a baby box. It is completely anonymous. There are no video cameras, and the law specifically exempts this individual from any civil or criminal penalties or neglect or abuse of a child for putting a baby in a baby box. The baby boxes are always placed at, say, firehouses or other establishments that are staffed 24/7. Alarm goes off to the local hospital, to the people there, and that baby is brought in. That baby is put up for adoption within a very short period of time. And so that's just another way. If you want to get involved with that, you could probably look that up in your particular state. Here in Indiana, certainly feel free to reach out to us. But that's just another way to be thinking. All right, if there are going to be babies delivered, if we have an abortion ban, and we're telling these women you must carry the baby to term, I think we can expect an increase in deliveries to these baby boxes. So we should be ready to adopt those kids. Number 9, again, how do we serve women and children in crisis? I've given you a number of very practical things. So number 9, some of you may be a little surprised by this one, but it is to advocate for life, And you think, well, that sounds really political. Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I believe that sanctity of life is a pre-political biblical belief. And as I mentioned towards the beginning of this episode, I was at the State House on Monday and was able to hear the arguments of the pro-choice movement, and to just see some of the anger and some of the rage, just sometimes aimed at those on the pro-life side, but sometimes it seemed like it's just rage and maybe just kind of shouting into the air type of thing. Things like I mentioned, 2468, separation of church and state, keep your theology out of my biology, those sorts of things. And I was reflecting on the fact that the law is a teacher. Now, it is the gospel that transforms our lives, but the law is a teacher, and it informs our consciences as to what is good, true, and beautiful. And our society has now for almost 50 years said, in the force of law, you do not have to consider the life of this unborn child. It is dispensable under certain circumstances in the face of countervailing issues, countervailing interests. And now that has been removed, the anger and the rage from those on the other side of this issue was just palpable. And it left me not angry with those that were were saying these things, but sympathetic in a way, almost sorrowful that the law has misled about what is true and what is good and what is just. And now that the law has changed and the state of Indiana is saying, no, we have to protect whatever freedom means. It is not it's not licensed to kill another human being. And then whatever the role of government it is, it at least extends to protect citizens from lethal violence. That's all that the Indiana legislature is really saying. And so advocating for life means that as Christians, we step into our community, our churches first, our communities, the public square, to say, here is how God designed us. Here is the family unit. Here's the purpose of our sexuality. And one of the things that just strikes you when you listen to some of these rallies is the comments about forced abortion, about forced pregnancy, forced birth, is that we're not all dumb here. Like we know how human pregnancy happens, and to say that there's nothing else, there's no other way to do this other than the child must die. I think the Christian public witness, the response to that is to say, well, here's our sexuality, here's how God defined it, how he designed us. This is what leads to true flourishing, and we're also going to protect the child in the womb. And so it can be for, I think, those that are not in the pro-life movement, a bit of a shock when the law, which has so long stated one thing, now moves to state something else, which I still think is true and good. But that's why we as the church need to advocate for morality that reflects God's truth, because that is what's going to lead to flourishing. And so advocating for life, for me, if there's any issue that is just a straight line from what Scripture says into public policy, it is this one. And so how do we care for women and children in crisis? Well, one of the ways we do that is by advocating for laws that reflect what is true. And so that I love the John Stone Street quote about ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. In the sense that our society is telling people what is not true, it is not going to lead to flourishing. It's going to lead to harm. And so advocating for life is, again, just another practical way that we as Christians can serve women and children in crisis, so that people order their lives around what is good and true rather than what our culture says leads to flourishing. And then the last one I would say is to advocate not just for the sanctity of life, but then to advocate for the care and treatment of the mother. A couple of practical thoughts here. And I'm actually going to have someone from SBA list, the Susan B. Anthony list, on the podcast sometime soon. We're just working out a few details there to talk about her plan, which is an effort to catalog services for women in each state, so that there would be a resource to point women in crisis to. And so we'll get you more information about that. That is just a new effort. It's still building up steam. I'm excited about seeing that come together. And then to give you an example of this, I wanted to share just a little bit about SB 2, which is in Indiana. SB 1 is the purported abortion ban being debated in the Senate. And then SB 2 is an effort to support pregnant women and babies. And SB 2, again, has just been proposed. It's still being hammered out. But just to kind of share with you the idea behind it, is that this would be a $50 million kind of quote unquote down payment on increasing services to pregnant women and children in our state. And this would include things like an increase in the tax credit for adoption, which is right now about $1,000. It would increase it to about $10,000. And then this $50 million would be put into various places. There'll be a new fund called the Hoosier Families First Fund, and then distributed to various state agencies for programs that can serve women and children in crisis. Also, the Senate mentioned that there are a number of other services like pregnancy care centers that are available to serve. Other states have actually provided some funding or at least grants to pregnancy care centers and other ministries to help increase services to women and babies. And so that's, again, just something to advocate for. If your legislature is taking up the issue of life, to ensure that not only are we going to say, here's what's good and what's true about the sanctity of life, but then how are we as a state going to go out and serve and help women in crisis, especially in a crisis pregnancy. And so that would be something to advocate for. And again, just an example of that, if you want to look up SB2, I'll have some links to the tie-in.gov and the legislative websites that has more detail about this particular issue. And so I know that's a lot for an episode, but let me run back through kind of those 10 ways I think that we can serve women and children in crisis. So first one is to pray. Maybe take a day to fast. And sometimes we don't talk about fasting all that much, but it's certainly clear in Scripture that helps move mountains. It helps move key issues forward. And I think so much about Daniel as we've been doing the Daniel manual. He had a person or a man of prayer when he faced big events. And so are we praying? Do we have planned prayer times? Or are we praying earnestly for God to move in this important and key moment? The next one would be supporting your local pregnancy care center, whatever your particular gifts or experiences are, to pour them into that pregnancy care center as kind of the first really obvious way to do this. The next one would be something like an angel house or a house that provides care and shelter for women in crisis pregnancies that may be an abusive situation. The next one is providing kind of temporary guardianships or support prior to a family being involved with the state, just wrapping them up, being the church, loving on people, and helping provide community for families that might face a life crisis. We all do at some point. We all need help. And what if somebody doesn't have that? How can the church step in and help in that way? I think that's a huge way that we can engage. The next one would be Care Portal. How do you provide just basic needs? And what's great about Care Portal is you have, certainly your church can be taking requests for needs, but then the state's also identifying needs, and you can show up as the church to care for that. The next one is something like a care community, building community around parents, around families that are providing foster care so that they're refreshed, so that they're supported in what they do. Just one other example there would be a church that I talked to today. They actually have small groups based around foster care families. And so you have foster care families supporting one another as well, just walking through that together. And then, of course, adoption, especially older teenagers and perhaps those babies that are being surrendered to the baby boxes. How can we jump in and be a source of adoption for that? And then number 9 was to advocate for life. That one of the ways that we serve those around us is to advocate for what is good, true, and beautiful. And so that our law reflects God's law and reflects what is true, and it would lead them to flourishing rather than to build their lives around what isn't true and what isn't going to lead to flourishing. And then finally, in this time when there's so much energy around attention toward the issue of life, we can advocate for care and treatment of the mother, vulnerable children. And I've given you some examples of what's happening here in Indiana, and that can be pursued around the nation. I was at a church service on Sunday, and a state rep, her name's Michelle Davis, said something there as she was just speaking to the crowd. And she said it was such a remarkable time to serve. What a time to serve. And she was just reflecting on the fact that, God had put her in the Indiana legislature, and she's there to try to wrestle through some of these tough issues that I described at the beginning of the episode. And that God has placed her there in the legislature as a believer to support the sanctity of life, to represent her district well. And I was thinking about that, and that it doesn't just apply to somebody that has the title state rep or state senator, but it actually applies to all of us as Christian citizens. As we talk about from time to time, we are citizen sovereigns. We, the people, have ultimate authority in the American system. And so God has placed us right here in this critical moment. Many of us, never thought it would happen in our lifetimes, but here we have the opportunity to support the sanctity of life and to support caring for women and children in crisis. And so, again, I wanted to just provide some practical ways that you might be able to engage these. Some of these particular initiatives are expanding. They may not be available in your area. Many of them would be, but I encourage you to look at this and just pray through what is at least one way that my family, my church can support women and children in crisis. It's so important right now. And so I encourage you to dive in.